A lot of Christians these days are really ignorant on their Old Testament.
The first Christians would tell them, go read the book of John. That's where we tell them to start. But where did the apostles go to find Jesus? What if we were a Jew before Christ came and all we had was the Old Testament?
The Mike Charleston Show.
All right, well, welcome to the Mike Charleston Show. This is another episode of Season 3. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching on YouTube, we appreciate it. Like and subscribe. If you're watching on or listening on podcasts, thank you. Share with a friend or something like that, I guess. Welcome, guys.
Oh, thanks.
We got Larry and Chuck and Sarah in studio here.
Yep.
So, the funny thing is, we've been really, really busy. Before we get right into this, we've been really busy. I guess we're so busy that this afternoon I get home from work. I'm looking over some things. She comes home with a smoothie, so I'm eating it. She goes pick up the van. We come back. I'm jumping in the shower. I come out of the shower. I take out my contacts. I brush my teeth. I think I'm going to bed. So I'm like, what am I doing? It's a little bright outside for that. So I'm like,
So I want to chase a rabbit from it because you mentioned that you were eating a smoothie.
Yeah.
So question of the audience, do you eat a smoothie or do you drink a smoothie?
Well, nowadays you can eat a smoothie because I got those bowls. But no, I was drinking.
I would say hopefully you drink a smoothie.
Yeah,
Well, it could be like a Frosty. You know, they give you a spoon and a straw.
Yeah, but it was a
That's
smoothie.
true.
I was out of a straw. So anyway, but
That is funny.
so I am here. I am not tired, I guess, and we're trying to get through this.
You had a positive affirmation.
That's right. That's right.
Well, it is weird to think. I mean, because now there's like no more weddings, and we got
still have
family
the
that's
camp.
gone, and
Camp's coming
that's
up.
right.
Camp's
Camp's
up.
coming up.
Once that's over,
That's what we keep saying after Ohio, but yeah, we'll see
Something
about
else
that.
will come up.
yeah.
After Ohio, it's only 2.5 months still.
Till the shindig. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's funny.
That's it.
Oh, so what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we are talking about finding Jesus in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's a pretty neat topic.
Yes.
I'm kind of excited. So we've been studying the book of John, Bible study on Thursday nights, and the book of John tells us who Jesus is.
Right.
But many Christians, when we talk to them, the first Christians would tell them, go read the book of John. That's where we tell them to start. But it begs the question, where did the apostles go to find Jesus?
Yeah, they didn't have the book of John, did they?
No.
John was there. He was talking.
They just had John.
Right. It really made me start thinking, a lot of Christians these days are really ignorant on their Old Testament.
On the Old Testament.
Right.
Well, some popular teachers, I can think of one in particular, said we should separate from the Old Testament. Yeah.
Yeah, Andy Stanley.
I think the word was unhitch.
Unhitch the
Yeah.
Old Testament, which is not true. And you actually you were listening to someone, and I thought it was kind of interesting. It's not completely true, but what did they say about the Old Testament? Why you can't understand it?
Oh, because they said that if you're not a Christian, then you still have the veil.
Right.
And so it's not until you find Christ and are born again that veil is removed. And then you can look back at the Old Testament, and all of a sudden it all starts making sense because there's a lot of things that are very hard to understand until you know Christ.
Well,
I don't know.
It's true from the point of that whenever you're a Christian, you're looking at the Old Testament through a Christian lens.
Right.
We're looking back to
we're in the
see,
future.
Right, we're looking back in from the future to see what it was. So, what if we were a Jew before Christ came and all we had was the Old Testament?
Yeah, and that's the kind of the point here is at the time of Christ, you're in Jerusalem, and you're hearing all these things. You're trying to figure out what's going on. You hear him, you see what he's doing, and you're like, well, is this Messiah? And so Messiah is a very interesting term in and of itself. For the Jews, and so that is what the whole point of this is. Can we find Jesus or Messiah in the Old Testament? And because that's what the disciples did. They used it. And in fact, I like what Chuck Missler said. He was like, there's one Bible study in one book that had 12 messages by 7 different people, and yet we don't really talk about it today. And I was in the book of Acts, and the 7 people that talked about it, they talked about Jesus from the Old Testament.
Right.
And we don't do that today. Now, granted, we don't really need to so much because we're not really interacting with a lot of Jews or people that know the Old Testament
Right.
very well. And so we can preach out of John, That makes it simpler, I guess. But that is the foundation of our faith is in the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
And that's where our foundation is and where it all begins. And it talks about Christ from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And
well, Sarah
onward.
brought up a good point because not having that veil, you look at the two men, the disciples on the road to Emmaus after Christ was crucified. They couldn't see it. Jesus, it says that he started from Moses and went through basically the whole Old Testament to show them Christ.
Right. He went from Moses to the prophets and showed him Christ.
And they've read all those.
Right.
But they just couldn't see it.
Right.
Which to me begs the question, how much is there that we can't see yet? We don't
See,
understand.
I would have liked to hear his sermon.
Yes.
I thought the same thought. I thought that before. I'd like to hear what did he have to say. But then it's there.
It's there. We can go back and read it. Yeah.
Yeah. So
we gotta research it and find it, and that's what we have our time doing. And this is very important. So it's not like that important that we run into a lot of Jews in our life that we're like, hey, and most Jews today don't even believe in God. Right. So it's more of a cultural thing, and so it's not like we're this is to persuade Jews, but it is a way of building our faith up and knowing where our roots are. I hate to say roots because it's like Hebrew roots. No, but our roots are founded in the Old Testament, and I know we were going to get into this later, maybe I'm ruining one of your questions there, Chuck, but the Bible is a book of prophecy. And that's what makes the Bible very unique than all the other books. Right. All the other books are usually written by one person, as far as I know. Maybe there's a couple out there, but like the Hindus, the Vedas, written by Confucius, maybe, or was it? I don't remember, but it was one person. Islam, the Quran was written by Muhammad,
right?
And so all these other religious books were written by one man. Even Joseph Smith, the Mormons, they written by one man, had a special revelation. But the Bible,
golden tablets,
the golden tablets with the glasses. But the Bible is over 1,500 years, 40 different writers, different cultures, different languages, even, and it's like a. It's like a hologram.
Yeah.
Where if you can take a little bit out this, people might doubt the reliability of the New Testament, and that's a big thing these days. People are doubting the New Testament. Well, can you prove Jesus by the Old Testament? Absolutely, this is kind of the point. You can take out a little bit of this, a little doctrine here. You could take grace out over here, but it's sprinkled throughout the whole Bible that you can't just take out the doctrines. It's an all-encompassing thing, and so you can't just twist it that easily, even though we try. And so that is what makes the scriptures is the prophecy. And so we have prophecy that God actually fulfills. And in Jesus, we have over 300 prophecies that are fulfilled. And if you listen to Chuck Missler's mathematical equations on this, that if you take 8 of those prophecies and one person the chances of one person fulfilling those are the same chances of you filling the state of Texas with silver dollars about, I don't know, what was it, 18
I don't remember
inches.
What he said. Yeah, it was
right. Even if it's an inch, it doesn't matter. And painting one of them red, and then you blindfolded get into a helicopter, and please don't go blindfolded in a helicopter, and reaching out and grabbing that coin. That's the chances. It's very astronomical, and so it's kind of fascinating to hear his mathematical approach to it. It's over my head. Yeah. But anyway, that's the important thing is the book of prophecy.
Paul used in the book of Romans, he went back and used Abraham as an example to show that God's going to use faith as a means of for our salvation.
Well, yeah. And if you look at the sermons, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here. Am I taking Larry's spot? If you look at the 12 messages in the book of Acts, it's kind of amazing their messages, because it's like if you had 3,000 people or whatever, a number of people to preach to, what would your message be? I don't think we would choose what they preached.
To be fair, the first one, Peter was speaking to the Jewish audience.
Right.
So he gave the whole history of Israel.
Well, not his first one.
Oh, well, kind of. I mean, in Acts chapter 2,
Right.
he went through a brief history. Then Stephen did the same thing, right?
Well, Stephen really went in depth, and it was interesting where he was going with that before he got killed.
Yeah.
But
that's one you would have liked to heard the end of.
Right.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And you're like, it was going such. I think they knew where it was going.
They knew where it was going. That's why they
It's time
stoned
to
him.
cut
Yeah.
That's right. But, like Peter starts out, so he was being creative because they were saying, they're drunk as you suppose.
Right,
And
yeah.
he's like, they're not drunk. This is actually from Joel. So he quotes Joel. And then he quotes, I forget it was from a psalm, right? I forget where that was. You had the note here and I can't see it.
I did. I think it's Psalm 110.
Oh, there it is. Psalm 16 and
16.
Psalm 110. That's
Okay.
right. So he combines those two. And here's the fascinating thing about all their messages in the book of Acts. They do not, how do I want to say this? I usually do it in a negative way. I got to do it in a positive. They never speak without speaking on the resurrection of Christ. So all their messages have the resurrection of Christ as part of their message. And I think that's interesting. So
Right, yeah.
if we're preaching, should we have the resurrection of Christ as a important part of our message? I would think so.
Yeah.
That's an important doctrine. And that begs the question, right? That maybe Chuck's going to ask. I don't know.
Possibly, but let's take a break. Let's go back a little bit.
yeah,
Because we have kind of got ahead of ourselves a little
Yes.
bit. Let's go back and look at the ideas of where Messiah is mentioned in the Old Testament.
Okay, so this is a trick question. Where is Messiah? So
The actual word?
what? I guess that's
Yeah, he's not asking a trick question.
okay. Where is?
Because, I mean, the actual word's only mentioned in Daniel, right?
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right. In the King James Bible, 2 times in Daniel.
Okay.
Right.
But
That's not
where
the
is
trick
the term?
question?
Where's the term
Concept.
Messiah? How is it used in the Old Testament? Because that's not obviously where the only place it's used.
Right. Is this the trick question?
No.
Okay. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, there's obviously the prophecy in Genesis chapter 3 with the seed of the woman
Right.
will crush the head of the serpent.
Well, that's
a prophecy, but it's not mention of Messiah. But that
I can't. Let's see here. Let me. Okay. If you're watching on YouTube, you see what I just did.
a long way down. Huh?
I have a printout here, a cheat sheet of 351 Old Testament prophecies fulfilled in Christ.
Right.
And some of them were a little bit of a stretch, but still, it talks about some of them were they don't necessarily use the word Messiah,
True.
but Messiah, they always believed that they would have a deliverer coming that would take away.
Well, you see that. I mean, especially in Genesis, there's a lot of pictures.
Foreshadowing.
Yes. Yeah.
As Hebrews would talk.
Right.
A lot of shadows and types and figures. And even now here's a fascinating one as you're studying. I taught on this one Sunday. In Genesis 5, it is very, very fascinating how it's buried within the context of the genealogies of all places. There's 10 genealogy, not 10 genealogy, one genealogy, 10 names from Noah to, from Adam to Noah. And the 10 people in that, actually, if you look at what their name means in Hebrew and whatever, it actually spells out the gospel.
Right. Yeah, it does.
And
That's right.
it's very, very fascinating.
Yeah.
And so even in the text itself, it's kind of hidden.
Right.
And you got types and shadows throughout that something is going to come and deliver the people from their enemies, from sin, from all these things,
Right.
and that would we would call Messiah.
So the term Messiah, the actual word Messiah, it means what?
the anointed one.
The anointed one,
Right,
the
yeah.
anointed. And in the Old Testament, it is used for a number of people. But it's interesting of who it's used for. So it's used for kings as anointed one. It's used for prophets.
Yes.
And it's used for priests.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that if you segment it out and just look and see where it's at, if you've got to put it back together, that's who it's used for: prophet, priest, and king.
And Jesus fulfills
And when
all
you
those.
look at
Right.
the Messiah that we think of as Jesus Christ, he's one of all.
Right. He's prophet. Was that for me? Oh, okay. She just kicked me. Anyway, prophet, priest, and king.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the three parts of what Jesus has to fulfill, and to the point where even the Qumran community, some of them were studying this, and they thought that there was going to be 3 Messiahs that were going to come, because they couldn't figure out how he could be a king and a prophet and a suffering servant. And so they were like, how's that going to happen? So is there going to be 3 stages of Messiah come? Unfortunately, now most Jews today don't believe in a literal Messiah. They believe in more of a spiritual Messiah, an age that's going to come. Well, they kind of have to because they've already rejected Jesus.
Right.
And so it's not some of the very specific prophecies about the Messiah could only be Jesus. There's only a certain time frame that this could have happened, and they missed the boat, and so they kind of have to believe that it might have been like a golden age. It's just an age, so it's no longer in a person that's going to come.
I wonder when they think that will be.
It might be even present now. I don't know. I don't know.
Because I wouldn't say we're in a golden age. I mean, it depends on your definition, but especially if you're in Israel.
Yes.
That's
all right, so we've touched on this a little bit already, but if we're looking at just the Old Testament, we're not looking at the New Testament. We're putting our blinders on. We're not looking ahead to see how the apostles did it. If we had just the Old Testament, how do you preach the gospel?
That's a tough one, because I'll be honest, it's not easy. Because we're so used to just going to 1 Corinthians 15, right? The life, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the gospel.
Right.
But how do you do that with the Old Testament, like if you didn't have that? And there is ways. I mean, obviously you talk about, you got to go back to the garden where God promises, his first promise is in Genesis 3:15, with the seed of a woman, and that's unusual to say it like that, because men have seed, not women, but the seed of a woman, and is going to bruise the head, and so there's always a promise of someone coming, a deliverer coming, and then there's pictures and types throughout. But Isaiah, I mean, the whole book of Isaiah, but
Isaiah 53 for sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Lamb of God, basically, is a perfect picture. The suffering
Psalms,
servant.
Was it 22, 23, and 24?
22, 23, and 24 are good ones. I don't know. That's like a fulfillment,
right?
And I don't know how you could. I mean, you preach Jesus. I guess it is preaching fulfillments of these prophecies, right?
Well, the thing is, we have the knowledge of. We can look back and say, "Oh, we understand what that means." Right. So, I think you have to have that, because otherwise, it doesn't. Don't know what it means,
right?
Like, why did God have Abraham sacrifice Isaac?
Right.
It doesn't really make any sense. But when you see the picture of what it is, when you see, oh, this is a picture of Christ or being crucified.
It's a foreshadow.
It's a foreshadow.
Right.
And I think that's why the apostles, they missed it. And the 2 men on the road to Emmaus, they had all the scriptures. They knew it. They knew the stories, but they couldn't understand it, because even Nicodemus in John chapter 3, when he says, you say we must be born again. What do you mean? He didn't understand.
Right, and actually, Jesus even says, "You're a teacher of the law, and you don't know these things."
How do you not know these things? But they didn't. The veil was still there. They couldn't see.
Well, that makes it so interesting for Paul, because Paul was a Jew. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisee. He is out doing the work of the Jew when he encounters Christ in a miraculous way, and then he is. I believe, like Mike, he's actually taught by Christ for a couple of years.
Too,
right.
And then he comes back in his teaching, and he goes back and he looks at the Old Testament. Anytime he refers to the Old Testament a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not the way the Jews looked at it.
No.
It's just a different view that he brings out whenever he's teaching. And for him to be able to take that and look back and say, here's this example.
Right.
And it's not of a Jewish picture; it's of a Christian picture.
Right.
That had to be hard for the Jews to take.
But the book of Hebrews, there's a lot of references to
Absolutely. It's just like a string of quotes.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And that's a good start if you wanted to reach someone that has a really good knowledge of the Old Testament, and the book of Hebrews is a great place to start. I mean, if you're not sure of how to present Christ, go to the book of Hebrews. Right. I mean, honestly, that does a fairly good job of presenting Christ from the Old Testament. I mean, they quote the Psalms where at the very beginning of Hebrews where he says, David said to my Lord, and that's where he was saying at this first message.
Right.
Peter was in the day of Pentecost. There, he was saying how he was talking about David and but David is dead.
Yeah.
But he's talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and so he said that must be talking about Jesus. Now the funny thing is, honestly, in all their messages, like in Bible college, when you go to Bible college, you talk about keeping things in context. Those guys ripped everything out of context, and it was like, well, it's all right if it's in the Bible, they can do that.
Well, one thing too.
It's an interesting quote that I heard. I'll just steal this from somebody else, but they say that Bible scholars, preachers, whatever you want to say, they're very good at taking apart the Bible, but not so good at putting it back together.
Right.
I like that. I like that.
What's the picture? What's the story? And truly, it's God's story.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is a number of different authors out there writing these books, but it's God's story, and it's all weaved together.
Yeah. So we can see the picture in the Old Testament because we have the New Testament. It's been revealed to us, and so we can.
It is easier.
Yeah, it's easier to go back. But if you didn't know, if all you have was the Old Testament to say, okay, well, where is Christ?
It's kind of like us with the second coming of Christ.
Exactly. Yeah,
and so we have a lot of the information, and a lot of us are guessing what it's going to look like.
Right.
What is it? What we argue about it. I mean, there's a lot of different views on it. And the same thing was with the Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law. They probably had ideas of what Messiah looked like. And so, it's.
I mean, as recently as 30 years ago, trying to understand how everybody would know at one time.
That's
and now it's like, of course we will.
Right. That won't be. That's a no-brainer there.
Well, and that's a good point because you look at prophecy, like you brought up, Mike, was the Bible's unique in that way. But when it talks about, like in Revelation, where the whole world will see the two witnesses, it's like, well, like you said, 50, 100 years ago, that made no sense at all.
Right.
You would have had to interpret that as something local, like everybody locally would see that.
Right.
But now we're like, well, that we can look at it on our phone. We
almost see it live, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Possibly see it live.
Right.
Or even buying and selling the whole, 50, 100 years ago, that wouldn't make any sense.
Right.
But now through integrated banking, online, all that, it's like, okay, well, it makes perfect sense.
Sure.
All right, so back to Christ in the Old Testament. So where's Christ first appear?
Okay, here's the trick question, right, Ben?
This is the trick question
It's
here,
not
right?
necessarily a trick question.
It's a
It
trick
wasn't meant to
question
be.
because I was like, where is Messiah?
It's not supposed
where
to
is
be.
Jesus first mentioned?
I came across
No,
it.
the question is, where does Christ first appear in the Scripture?
Yeah.
Right. And so she was saying this is a trick question because I was thinking about it and I'm like,
that is an
okay,
interesting.
so Abraham.
He just looked at me like, how can we know? And I'm like, oh.
So the answer, according to Sarah, is what?
Yeah, Sarah.
Genesis 1:1.
Right.
Because he was there at creation, because we know from John 1.
He wasn't just
that's
at
right, yeah.
creation. He created everything.
Right,
That's
well, he was
definitely
before
not a wrong
creation.
answer.
But we know from John 1 that everything that was created was created by him. Same in Colossians, where it verifies that again. So we know he was there from Genesis 1:1.
Right. So he was there from the very beginning, and he actually created everything. So that is kind of a tricky question.
true.
That's fair.
Well, what about when God came to Abraham? Do you think he was there as well?
Well, that's
when God was going to reveal his plan about Sodom and Gomorrah.
right. That's the theophanies.
Yeah.
And I was actually talking to your son-in-law today, a guy you're related to by marriage.
Yeah, that would be one of them.
Yes, and we actually were talking about that, the theophanies, and I'm not sure. It's something I might think that is Jesus in the Old Testament there. In bodily form and takes on a bodily form, or maybe it was an angel. I don't know.
What about Melchizedek?
Yeah, that's
Melchizedek?
the next
That's
question.
another
I was
one.
wondering that too.
Yeah, I don't think so, but
Maybe a type or picture.
oh, definitely,
definitely a type, yeah.
I mean, I've gone back and forth throughout my life with Melchizedek, and I'm not sure. I don't know.
What about the fourth
So
man
you
in the fire?
lean
the
against
fourth
now?
man in the fire? So yeah, that definitely was. So I definitely believe that was Christ, with them in the fire. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, but to tell someone that was who that is, and be definitive. I don't know if we can. We can be
Right. Speculate.
right and just be like, I'm pretty sure that was. I mean, that's my best guess now that we're in the future. But anyway,
It's interesting there that they actually use the the words that they use, because it looks like the Son of God.
Yeah.
Right.
Not just an angel, not
Right.
just
Yeah.
someone. It's like, the words. That's an interesting take, because obviously Nebuchadnezzar wasn't thinking about God's son.
Right.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. But all right, so we're going to try to preach the gospel out of the Old Testament. What story do you pick?
I think it's pretty obvious.
See, I feel like there are 3 top ones. So.
Yeah,
top 3.
I can think of 3. I don't know if they're the same as yours.
Number
Interesting.
3.
What's your obvious one?
Well, I think Abraham and Isaac
Yeah,
would
that's
be
where I would
That's
go.
the
one,
most
yeah.
Abraham and
obvious.
Isaac.
Okay, is that one of your 3?
That's
yeah,
one of mine.
That's one.
That's one.
Okay.
Actually, no, that would be 4. Oh, no, Abraham, Isaac. Yeah, that'd be one.
Well, the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac,
yeah.
and then God Himself providing
Yeah.
a sacrifice, so that one I think is obvious.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear you guys, see if you guys match.
Well, all right. What do you?
Okay, well, the next one that I think is rather obvious is the serpent on the pole.
The serpent on
If
that's
I
a
be
good
lifted
one.
up,
That'd be
I'll draw
4.
men
Yeah,
unto
that's-
me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
great. You just look
it even
on
says that in the
him.
New Testament, just
Yeah.
like
Right.
as
Right.
Moses lifted up the serpent, so Christ will be lifted up all men. Wow! If you could hear that, that was
thunder.
shocking.
That was thunder.
I hope to get the dogs. Okay. Anyway, what's your third? Was that one of your second? That wasn't your
No,
second.
that was
That was
I
Oh,
didn't think about that.
wow,
That
we've
was
got
a-
more. Well,
Yeah.
my other one was Joseph. I just feel like last year
Joseph
going
is a
through
good one.
the
Joseph's a
whole
good
story
one.
of Joseph,
Yeah.
I'm
There's so
like,
many.
wow, it's so close.
Yeah,
Well, I
Joseph.
would say the Passover lamb.
Okay, the
Oh,
Exodus.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
for sure.
a really good one. The
And-
Exodus.
You know my other one I'd pick.
At the
No?
garden.
Yeah. That's a picture right there.
Which of the serpent or the
Well,
the,
where God
Oh, where
obviously
he killed the lamb to
Yeah.
cover
The
them.
lamb to cover
yeah.
them.
cover them.
Oh, that's and we were talking about earlier, and one of the kids said also Ruth, the kinsman
the
redeemer.
kinsman redeemer. That's
Yeah.
that's
I mean-
That's a
so
great one.
you start thinking about these things. They start popping up,
Yeah,
and
there's
you're
so
like,
many.
yes, Joseph was a good one. Abraham and Isaac to me sticks out.
Oh, yeah.
The Exodus, the same thing, right?
whole
I mean,
Exodus,
come
yeah.
on.
Yeah.
What about
Yeah.
the picture, the cleansing of the leopard?
Okay, in Leviticus 14?
Yeah.
we just
Yeah.
talked
That's
about
a-
that.
yeah, it's a big
And
picture there.
It is.
Yeah.
And you really start diving in, you can start seeing the pictures.
Yeah.
So that's the point of this, is to encourage you to look. And once you see, I mean, they just start popping
Yeah,
out.
it's-
Kind of like looking in the book of John, to look at the deity of Christ. It just pops out everywhere.
Yeah.
Which there's a verse in John, speaking of John 5:39. What does that say, babe?
To search the scriptures, for in them ye think ye have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me.
So that's Jesus talking, and he's talking to the Pharisees and the teachers of all our people, and saying that, you search the scriptures for eternal life, but guess what? They speak of me. So, when you're looking in the Old Testament, like every page, it's about Jesus.
Yeah.
It is very fascinating. So, Old Testament, people think it's boring, and it's like, there's a couple interesting stories, but the rest of it is like, what are we talking about? You're not looking hard enough. There's a lot of pictures of who Jesus is. And so if the power goes out, it's probably because we're having a storm.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
Well, what about the minor prophet?
Jonah.
No, Hosea. No.
Well, Jonah's a good one too.
Jonah.
yeah,
Jonah.
Belly of the whale,
I
3
was thinking
days,
of,
2 nights.
but this is more of a picture of Israel.
Hosea with the prostitutes.
Yeah,
And-
yeah.
Yep.
And the
So yeah,
redeeming.
like I said, if you start
there. It's-
thinking about them, there are a number of
Yeah, God always
ways
has
you can
these
use it.
pictures of deliverers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
a lot of them are stories, and we
Right.
love
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
use it. And so it's a great picture.
But yeah, it's funny because the more we talk about it, the more we come up with.
I know, because you
examples
said
of them.
deliver, and I'm like, oh, Joshua.
Yes,
Yeah.
Joshua,
There.
Joseph.
We said that one.
I said
Yeah, I know,
Joseph.
but I mean, yeah. it's
Joseph
just-
again.
Yeah,
Joseph again. Why not? It's okay. Okay.
Anyway.
All right, let's go back to John. So let's go to it's interesting question here. Where did Moses write about Jesus? So read John 5:46 and what Jesus says here.
Yeah, it says, for had ye believed Moses, ye would have believed me, for he wrote of me. And this is part of the kids' study passage in the Bible. So I read this every day, and I had to stop. I'm like, I don't remember Moses ever saying anything about Jesus. So I
it
had
is
to go
also
look it up.
when you say Moses, you are talking about the Pentateuch, the
Right.
Tanakh,
Yeah.
the first
Yep.
5 books of the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
But what do you have there?
Well, so one that we came up with was Numbers 24:17. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Sheth. Whoever that is. But that star out of Jacob, I think, is referring to Jesus, right?
Right, and it's interesting, the scepter.
Well, it's easy to see that now, right?
Exactly.
Through our lenses, we look at it and say, oh, yeah, that speaks of Jesus. So if you looked at it from a Jewish perspective and they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, who would they look at that to be?
Well, they'd be looking.
You think they'd still be looking, or they wouldn't assign that possibly?
Today?
Yeah.
I don't know, because there's a lot of prophecies that don't make sense because they have to believe in a spiritual awakening or something like that, because a lot of the prophecies are so specific that it's impossible for that to be fulfilled now. And
so this one, I think, though, I think they could possibly just assign it to David.
Well, a number of them would. Like David is going to come back somehow and restore the kingship of the king of David somehow. But no, this is the scepter. That's the one that is a problem with them, because the scepter was a sign of authority,
right?
And the capital punishment, and that was taken away from them. And that's when a lot of Jews thought the scriptures were broken, but they didn't know was that in Bethlehem the Messiah was already born when that had taken place, and so it didn't mess up anything at all. So by the time the scepter was taken away and it was given to the Romans, Jesus was already born. So they had thought one of those prophecies was very specific, that the scepter wouldn't be taken away from Shiloh. And I think it was Shiloh.
Right,
And so they thought that the scriptures had been broken at that point, and all is lost at that point. But Jesus fulfills that. So there's a number of those types where, I mean, like I said, I printed out 351. I know there's over 300. I think they were being zealous on a few of them. But they that you can go and look at that. That's very specific. Like, he has to be born of a virgin. He has to be, born in Bethlehem. I mean, these are very specific. Right?
Well, it was Bethlehem Ephrata. I think is how you say it. So it even narrowed it down even smaller.
I can't just fulfill this, right? It's not me, because we're over here, and it has to be a certain time frame. And
his lineage on both sides, he goes back to David.
Yes, right.
So he was the rightful heir through Mary's line or Joseph's line, but he wasn't really Joseph's.
Were you done with Moses?
No, let's go to another one. Let's give the other example she's got here. Acts 3:20-22.
Says, and he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom the heaven must receive until the times of restitution of all things, which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. For Moses truly said unto the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you.
So they're talking about Deuteronomy 18:18-19, right?
Yep, which basically says the same thing. I will raise them up a prophet. So
you don't want to reread it?
I mean, I can read it if you want. It's almost the same exactly as the Acts passage. So
yeah, so Moses spoke.
And also, I mean, Genesis, like he already mentioned, Genesis 3.
Right.
That's also a writing of Moses. And
right. So when Moses, they are talking about the whole law, but specifically, I mean, they know their stuff. The disciples were well learned on the scriptures, maybe not as much as the teachers of the law, but that's what the Pharisees were kind of shocked, because these guys were just fishermen, and here they are speaking with authority and know their stuff. They know the scriptures. And so that's very, very important. There's so many Christians that don't know their stuff.
So you got a note here, and I don't know this one, so I'm curious to see what you have. So when it says when Jesus wanted to establish his deity, he went to the Old Testament. What are you talking about there?
Oh, yeah.
So here's the quote, right? Including all of the New Testament writers, there are 312 different Old Testament passages referring specifically. Some have suggested there's as many as 2,000 New Testament texts that allude to an Old Testament passage. There are only 50 Old Testament references in Romans alone. So so when Jesus wanted to establish his deity, obviously he had to go to the Old Testament. He didn't have the New Testament to go to.
Right.
But he referred back to the scriptures, the Old Testament. And so that's what we were talking about, the 300 some verses that allude to him, and he always pointed back, to the prophecies.
Well,
basically,
like he said in John 5 that we read earlier, search the scriptures,
Right.
for you'll find me. That's where you'll find me.
speaks of
They
me.
speak of me.
Right.
So it's like, and the scriptures were obviously the Old Testament because they didn't have anything else at the time.
Right, and then like a good example is Ezekiel 34:23.
Okay. It says, and I will set up one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them, even my servant David. He shall feed them, and he shall be their shepherd.
Oh, there's my servant David. He's the from David's line and all that. In John 10:11 and 16,
It
he says,
I'm the good shepherd. The good
Right.
shepherd giveth his life for the sheep, and other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd.
right. And so there's a number of those type things that you could go search. And actually, we have some links that maybe we can put on there that have this all nicely put out and organized already, so you don't have to.
Right.
But maybe you don't want to do that. Just do your own research
Right,
and have the fun yourself in searching some of those things. So yeah, finding Christ in the Old Testament, that is where our roots are, where we get our foundation from. And it's just like, well, Christ just shows up on the scene, and like, well, who is he?
Right.
And that's why I like, the Bible is a book of prophecy, and that makes ours way different than everybody else, and it fulfills these prophecies. And that's how we know that this book is outside of time. It's
Right.
not just written by a man who claims to have a vision. This is throughout time and beyond time, because only God could make this happen and fulfill all these prophecies. And especially in Christ, that one person alone it's impossible for it to be any other person but him. It has to be him.
Well, somebody I was reading said the Bible's unique in that it has two separate parts, the Old and the New Testament, and it's separated by, I think, 4 centuries.
400 years.
Yeah,
So,
wow.
that's a big span of time. So you have all these prophecies, and then hundreds of years later,
Right.
they're all fulfilled. I mean, it's amazing.
Right. And that's where we are in some ways, that we have prophecies that still have yet to be fulfilled. And I've heard that 24% of the Bible is prophecies, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And some of those aren't fulfilled yet. And so people are like, what about those? Well, if God fulfilled the other ones, I think he'll keep his
Yeah, keep
promise.
it going.
Yeah, he'll
And
keep it
so
going.
we're waiting for a lot of those other to be fulfilled yet.
Right.
But we wait patiently. In 400 years was a long time where people thought God was silent. And it's been 2,000 years. And people think God is silent. And I'm like, nope.
No.
At the right time,
Yep.
he will
Well, that's
come.
what Paul said. In the fullness of time,
Yep.
Christ came. So
Yeah.
Yeah, we should keep
Or
in
not
mind
Paul,
as we study whatever part of the Bible that we're in, wherever we're studying, if we're focused on a particular passage or a particular book, we need to remember that the whole book is God's story.
Yes.
And it's a one big picture that all fits together, and it's his redemption for mankind.
Absolutely.
Right.
So it fits in everywhere we go, and they're all. It's not disjointed. It's one piece.
And when you say God's story, it's specifically the story of Jesus. Like
Yep.
we
Yes.
think it's God's
All him.
story, and then the New Testament, Jesus comes on the scene. But it's like,
It's
no,
not.
he's
Yeah, it's all
through the
continuing.
whole thing.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Who referred to it as a red thread?
Scarlet thread.
Scarlet
Chuck
thread.
Missler, I heard
Yeah.
from him.
Yeah,
but-
it's been throughout. I mean, I don't know who originated it, but the scarlet thread, it weaves in and out in the story of Christ.
Yeah.
So, all right, guys. Well, thanks a lot. And hope you guys enjoyed that. Do your own study. Go look for Christ in the Old Testament, because it is very important.
And it's fascinating, too.
It's
to
very
see. Yeah.
fascinating.
Eye-opening.
So, all right. Well, let's get out of here, Joshua.